Noam Chomsky, an iconic figure of the American and global left, a renowned linguist and even more famous political activist and analyst, a self-described libertarian socialist who often staked out positions far from the mainstream. His views on subjects like the role of the state and mass media, even when highly controversial, have often become massively influential. Web editor Jotam Confino interviewed Chomsky and joins us now. Jotam, some know Chomsky as sort of a big name of the 60s, of the 70s, but you describe him as being extremely relevant today. Why?
First of all, I think it's worth noticing that the almost 90-year-old Chomsky, his academic work is still being taught at universities across the world, and he's still being cited by international figures like Edward Snowden. And for that, I think that you could definitely say that he's still relevant. And I sat with him in Tucson, Arizona, where he's now teaching at the university, and we spoke a little bit about media, Israel, and U.S. Donald Trump.
So before we talk a little bit more about that, let's hear Noam Chomsky in his own words. Here are Jotam Confino and Ariel Levin-Waldman.
More than 50 years after making a name for himself for his political activism, Noam Chomsky is still teaching, writing books, and engaging in public debate about politics. Although he strongly opposes U.S. President Trump and the Republican Party, which he has called the most dangerous organization in the world, he points to a number of his foreign policies which should be praised.
Some of the things he's most condemned for are praiseworthy, in my view. The main one is actually North Korea.
We said point number one, denuclearization. And for some reason, the press doesn't pick that up. But that was actually point number one. They've agreed to denuclearization. And they continue to agree.
There was a critically important declaration last April between the two Koreas, North and South. It was the Panmunjom Declaration. Very important declaration. The two Koreas laid out fairly detailed proposals of how to move towards integration, reduction of tensions, economic interaction, and denuclearization. And furthermore, they're following that timetable. And they added that they wanted the two Koreas agree to move forward on this plan on their own accord. Crucial words. In other words, leave us alone. And that's pretty much what Trump has done. He hasn't interfered much. He's been bitterly condemned for the Singapore meeting with Kim, but he should be praised for it.
One of Chomsky's main critiques of U.S. foreign policy is its history of meddling in foreign affairs, such as toppling democratically elected leaders and influencing election outcomes. In his words, the U.S. is therefore in no position to point fingers at Russia for interfering with the 2016 presidential election. He therefore shares Trump's policy towards Moscow.
I think he's right in saying we have to do something to try to reduce the tensions. That's very serious.
Chomsky has criticized Israel's treatment of the Palestinians for decades and has written several books about the Middle East conflict. About to turn 90, the Jewish-American professor echoes the warnings of a late Jewish intellectual who spoke about the consequences of occupation after the Six-Day War.
You're in Israel, so look at one of the most respected figures in Israel, now died, but you may know him, Yehoshua Leibovitz. Back in 1967, after the conquest and the occupation, he warned that if the occupation continues, Israeli Jews are going to turn into what he called Judeo-Nazis. It's a pretty strong term to use in Israel. Most people couldn't get away with it, but he did. And it will happen, he said, simply by the dynamics of occupation. If you have your jackboot on somebody's neck, you're going to have to find a way of justifying it. Take Gaza. If you're going to place 2 million people in a concentration camp, which is in effect what it is, put them under a vicious siege, which makes life barely possible, impose on them what is officially called a diet. Officially, it's a diet in which they're not It can't go too low because we can't let them all starve or it won't look good, but it can't go above the level of bare survival. 95% of the water is undrinkable. The power systems have been destroyed by Israeli bombing, the sewage everywhere. You can't let them go out and fish because gunboats drive them back. Every couple of years you move in and smash them up again. If you do that kind of thing, you have to ask yourself, each Israeli says, am I justified in doing this?
As Chomsky nears the end of his career, his opinions are as strong and controversial as ever. Only time will tell how his legacy will be judged.
Well, controversial as ever, Jotam, but one of the things I find interesting about Chomsky is that especially his theories on the media and his criticism of the media, which he described it as manufacturing consent, have been even taken up by figures on the right. I mean, it's their version of fake news.
That is true, Kalev. And he mentioned one specific example that was very interesting in this regard. So the murder of the Saudi journalist, Jamal Khashoggi. Yeah. He says it's a classic example of the media tending to obsess over one issue, but overlooking what is really important. And in this case, he says we should look towards Yemen, because Yemen is really the issue that should be brought into the media's attention. And if you're going to criticize President Trump, you should criticize him for his support of Saudi Arabia's bombing in Yemen. So that's an example of the media being dismissive of the important issues.
Indeed, it's fair to say that in the wake of that murder, there was certainly more attention given not only to Saudi Arabia's role in the war in Yemen, but certainly U.S. support for it. We saw some statements from Mike Pompeo, from Jim Mattis coming out after maybe a little bit under the gun, needing to speak about it. Jotam, another thing that I know is a key issue for Chomsky, I think you spoke to him about it, the right wing, the notion of populism. That is certainly a very current trend. What did he have to say about that?
Indeed, and we did talk about right-wing populism in Europe and in South America and in the world in general. And his point is that the racism and the xenophobia that we see sweeping across the world it's a pathological symptom. We're not looking towards the real issue here. So the anger of the people across the world it stems from the 2008 financial crisis. Mm-hmm. And that's one of his main arguments. Like he's been criticizing neoliberal programs since the late 1970s and arguing that this creates a certain segment in the society which is rich and wealthy, and people will get angry when they're being overlooked like they did in the 2008 financial crisis.
Well, he still has that Marxist outlook that at root it's a class struggle in some ways, but still a relevant figure even in our times, controversial as he remains.
And 90th birthday next month, I believe. Is that right?
Indeed.